I'm fairly sick of thinking like me, like Steve, ego being. I prefer thinking like the prophets, okay? I always feel better when I think like the guys and gals who have done this before me way better than me. And there's certain ways of thinking and believing that work, and there's lots of ways that don't work. Oftentimes when I do it my way, which is called the ego, it doesn't work so well. I suffer as a result. But many great masters before us have told us some things about a better way to think and be. And my experience is when I apply that stuff, I can go try it out, and if it feels more comfortable, I'm going to keep doing that. Thank goodness there's this scientific phenomenon called Hebb's Law that says whatever you practice, you get good at, okay? What you practice, you improve at. Practice makes perfect. Neurons that fire together wire together. Our brains are set up that way. Whatever we practice, we get good at. And that includes thinking patterns, right? So today we're going to go over some things that help with the thinking process, that teach us a thing or two about what's true in the world because it's more effective. It works way better. Two of my favorite scriptures, James 1:8 and Romans 8:28, help with this. Okay? In James 1:8 it says, "A double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." Well, what's a double-minded man? If you think about it, we all have two minds. One is the spiritual mind, one is the physical mind. One is the mind of the soul, one is the mind of the ego. One focuses on spirit and one focuses on flesh. When he was going to be crucified and Peter tried to stop it or said, "We shouldn't do this," or "It shouldn't be done to you," Jesus said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You're focused on the affairs of man. I'm focused on the affairs of God." Jesus was specifically saying to Peter, you're looking at this physically, and he called that Satan, to look at things physically. He's focused on the affairs of God, means he was looking at it spiritually. So the double-minded man is especially someone who thinks they're spiritual, but they keep looking at it physically. And that person is unstable in all his ways. It's very difficult to pull off being spiritual and being ego. In fact, I would say it's impossible. When Jesus says, if your eye is single, your whole body would be filled with light, he's telling us to focus, right? Focus on the spiritual truths. As soon as we go to ego, we're going to debate this or that, good or bad, left or right. Once we do that, we're going to be unstable. A double-minded man is going to be unstable, but the single-minded man looks at the world spiritually and spiritually alone, and therefore they escape suffering. In order to pull that off, we have to look at everything in the world as spiritual. Romans 8:28, all things work together for good for those who love God, is a great example of this. All things. Doesn't mean some things, or things that I was conditioned to believe, or things that my culture believes, and not other cultures, right? All things work together for good for those who love God, meaning there's something that's happening in everything that has a good quality to it. It just means that everything's good. In the Bible it says, eat off the tree of life. To eat off the tree of life is to look at all things as good somehow. You won't be a double-minded man then. You also won't be unstable then. We have the ability to look at all things spiritually. And that means we can look at everything and include it in the as a piece of the puzzle of what humanity is really all about. Everything has its role, everything has its place. One simple example of throwing this in, I became a big fan of REBT. It's a mental health therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy, about 15 years ago. And I did this with a lot of clients that I really liked it, and I started to realize over time how effective this was when applied spiritually. We'll do that in a second. But it's such a simple little mental health treatment because it's as simple as ABC. A means stuff happens. It stands for activating event. Stuff happens to you. B is the belief you have about that stuff, and C is consequences, meaning the feelings we have and the behaviors that we act out accordingly to the experience and the belief that we just had. Albert Ellis, who came up with REBT, he emphasizes it's the B, or the belief, that matters most. A, stuff happens. It doesn't. Most of us just jump straight to C and say, you know, somebody keys my car, I'm angry. Why? Because they keyed my car. No, I have a belief about the keying of my car that makes me angry. And Ellis said this is always the case. No matter what happens to you, there's a belief that defines your experience that gives you a reaction, emotional or behavioral reaction. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, a guy that has great street cred because he went through the Holocaust, he developed a therapy called logotherapy that's exactly this as well. He said, it's not the experience that I had, including the Holocaust, it's the story I tell myself about the experience, which is the beliefs we have about the activating events. It's a beautiful therapy because it gives us power, and no matter what circumstances we're in, we have power. Whatever the A is, we always have a B we can focus on. And we change the C not by changing the A, but by changing the B. Our beliefs mean everything. In Ephesians 4:23, Apostle Paul says we should be renewed in the spirit of our minds. The spirit of our minds. To be renewed. When we get stuck, it's because we're stuck in ego development. And yet the spirit can come through this by changing our beliefs, right? Not sticking to myopic points of view and insisting I'm right and you're wrong. It's somehow going bigger and larger than that, becoming more inclusive, being a peacemaker by trying to join everybody together somehow under the same large tent of beliefs. The same sort of laws, like the law of gravity, that's working on everybody all the time here on earth. It's always working, even if you're not thinking about it, it's still working. There's spiritual truths out there that are great beliefs that work all the time. A lot of us pick beliefs, like in the United States, one of a low-level belief that doesn't work so well is, you gotta respect me. It just doesn't work that well for happiness, because a lot of times people are not going to give you respect. And if your belief is, I must be respected in order to feel better, then we're setting ourselves up for suffering. Along come the prophets who say things like, well, it's not really whether or not you get respected, it's whether or not you do the respecting. I actually feel less suffering when I respect others, independent of whether or not they respect me. Part of what forgiveness is. So there's beliefs out there that can renew ourselves. We can feel better by having different belief systems. That's what REBT is, and that's what Paul is saying in Ephesians 4:23. Now, part of all things working together for good, I like to weave together all different philosophies and religions into the same sort of idea that we're all working on a collective evolution of our consciousness, and we will feel better from a mental health perspective if we actually do the beliefs that work, okay? And so in Buddhism, there's a mind training approach called Lojong. And this approach is very specific. It's 59 different slogans, or beliefs, mottos if you will, that are bedrock truths, okay? Like gravity, they work all the time. I like to say, test them out. Test drive it. If it works for you, stick with it. It might be uncomfortable to start, but they're beliefs that work. As Ellis demonstrated in RBT, if you dispute various beliefs and they become more effective for you, you're going to stick with those beliefs. Change your belief system and you feel better, you know it's true because it worked. And if you repeat, thanks to Hebb's law, you practice it again and again and again, you're going to keep doing that belief. But why would we stick with beliefs that don't work? Right? Beliefs of separation. Beliefs of other as enemy. Right? And you're the cause of my pain. Those beliefs aren't especially effective. Certainly not on an emotional level. I'm suffering because you did something to me, and if I'm demanding an apology all the time, I'm going to stay stuck. Prophets, Jesus in particular, came along and said, you're freed if you just forgive. And that's a belief. Well, try the other one. Keep waiting for an apology. You're going to stay stuck. Not that there's not a role for apologies. There certainly is. We're just talking in the spiritual world. There's a belief that you can take that frees you from any circumstance. Okay? So Lojong is a practice that helps the Buddhists work towards something called Bodhichitta. And Bodhichitta is the clear-minded state. It's the state of the enlightened mind. It's a mind that strives towards awakening, empathy, and compassion for the benefit of all sentient beings. Okay? Everyone. It's not just for me, it's to do it for everyone. That's loving another as oneself. Okay? And it's awakening, empathy, and compassion for the benefit of all. That's bodhicitta. One of the practices to experience bodhicitta is called Lojong. And Lojong, I believe, was about 1,000 years ago when a Buddhist came across or developed this philosophy, this training, if you will, mental training, to help facilitate beliefs that actually work. Instead of thinking like Steve, I'd rather think some of these beliefs. Now, there's 59 of them. I'm not going to go through all of them. I picked my dozen favorite, and we're going to just touch on some of them. And realize this, if you think like this, and you practice some of these thoughts work. You'll feel better as a result. Suffering decreases by practicing these particular beliefs. And these are beliefs that are available to everybody, right? And everybody that does these beliefs, given enough time and practice, will say the same thing. That works. I like it. I'm glad I did that. So here's the Lojong method, or at least coming up with 12 different aspects of this method. And these are all I picked them, so I'm going to comment on them. Some people might have a slightly different impression of them, but for the most part, they're pretty clear. One of them is, all Dharma agrees on one point, that spiritual teachings are to lessen ego. All Dharma is teachings. And our life experience of the teachings. And all are pointing to one thing, to lessen the ego. So what's the ego? The double-minded man, as we talked about before, is when we think we're physical and we think we're spiritual. Now we're double-minded. The truth is you're a spiritual being having a physical experience. So that makes you spirit. If you think you're the body, that's the ego. And that has a perspective of things like good and bad. It's just the thing that we all have. We're afflicted by it. It's like a virus, and everybody has it at one point. We're all sickened by it at some point. But Dharma is agreeing on one point. All spiritual teachings are to lessen the ego. The Course in Miracles says that we're all separated from the Spirit, from love, from God, by barriers. And all we can do is remove those barriers so we can access that Spirit. Well, it's the ego that's that barrier. And so Dharma is attempting to do that. All point to the same thing, the lessening of the ego. Another of the slogans, we should regard everything as a dream. Although experiences may seem solid, they are just passing memories. What a great Lojong teaching. Everything's a dream. Albert Einstein said, equals MC squared. Everything is made of energy. It's not even physical. How could the ego have a perspective when there's actually nothing physical? The ego doesn't even exist. It's a perception or a misperception of the nature of the world that we're in. Everything is energy. That means nothing could actually be physical. It's just an illusion. So regard it as a dream. You have a dream at night. It's a mental state. Nothing physical is happening. You're perceiving a bunch of images inside your mind. And yet none of it is actually concrete. Well, that's no different than this. Spiritual beings having a human experience in which you think it's physical. Although experiences may seem solid, they're just passing memories. I think this is perfect when we liken it unto a movie. When you're at a movie theater, you're watching a movie, you know it's just a movie. And it's a passing movie. It's an experience, all right. What happens after the movie ends? You leave the theater. And you can think about it later, but it's a passing memory. The life that we're in is like that. It's a 3D interactive movie. It's going to go away. At some point it'll pass as well. And you'll have it as a memory, just like you do yesterday and 3 years ago. Okay? But if you regard it as a dream, part of the Lojong practice is going to help you realize Bodhichitta. Stop obsessing over this place as if it is somehow eternally real, because it isn't. Another slogan, self-liberate at all times. I like to emphasize Buddha's last words, strive for your own liberation with diligence. Well, that's this. Self-liberate. Well, what are we supposed to liberating ourselves from? The ego. The double of the double-minded part. Okay? You're not your physical being. Your physical being is a temporary experience. Your eternal being is a light experience. It's a spiritual experience. That's what you actually are. Self-liberation is you keep working on your detachment from the false self, and then you'll have self-liberation. Ephesians 4:22, which is right before Ephesians 4:23, to renew our lives with our minds, is to put off your old self. This is Apostle Paul saying, put off your old self, get rid of the ego. Okay? Get rid of that old being and move into the actual being that you are, the spiritual self. Next slogan. Rest in the nature of the essence or the present moment. Okay? All of our pain comes from either fearing the future, call that anxiety, or resenting or rejecting the past. That's called depression for the most part. I wish that didn't happen. I hope this doesn't happen. That's our mental health. In this present moment, 99.9% of the time, we've all got the same thing going on. Most of the time. And it's just this experience. Observing the world through this lens is much more peaceful. Staying grounded in the present moment is a way to bodhicitta. The next slogan, be a child of the illusion. If this place is like a movie, what are we? Actors and actresses. Okay? A child of the illusion is to recognize that the illusion, like the Tao Te Ching says, is the mother of 10,000 things. Well, really, it's the mother of 7 billion people who are all actors and actresses. Okay? Be a child of the illusion. Think of yourself that way. It's probably not a thought you've had too often. I'm a child of an illusion. Try that out. When you're driving in traffic and you're feeling stress, I'm a child of an illusion. See if it works. See if it doesn't shift your perspective a little bit. Why are you a child of the illusion? Because you know who the father and the mother is in this case? Your spiritual self. The other realms. Eternity, God, whatever you want to call it. There's a higher version of the self, and the lower version is the child. Here we are, and we are children of this illusion. Next slogan. When the world is filled with evil, transform all mishaps into the path of the Bodhi. Now the Bodhi is someone that has been able to pull off Bodhicitta, clear-minded state. Bodhisattva is a clear-minded being. And that person takes the world that's filled with evil and transform all mishaps into this. This is what alchemy is. Taking difficult life circumstances and flipping it into light. We think it's bad. Well, let's neutralize that by adding spirit to it. If I'm in traffic, it's easy to neutralize that by being more patient, right? And if I'm fearing death and I develop the awareness that I cannot die, for I'm an eternal spiritual being, that's pretty much what Jesus came to do, is to overcome the grave by showing us none of us can die, stop being so addicted to these bodies. What I've got there is taking what I'd otherwise think, or the ego thinks of as a bad thing, and it's turned it into a good thing. That's what alchemy is. Take darkness and turn it into light. So if you see evil, what's your job? If you want to be bodhicitta on the bodhicitta path, is take your negative experience and flip it into light. There's a different belief out there that's going to work more effectively. Next slogan. Love this one. Drive all blame into one. This one's phenomenal. Most of us spend most of the time seeing the world as fractured. You're different than me, I'm different than you, and all these different religions and all the races and all the genders and all that stuff. There's so much difference going on, and so there's a lot of blame to go around. Well, if we drive all blame into one, we're going to make this a lot more simple, and here's what it is. The one is the ego. It is the perception of the false self, the perception of the world as physical. It's an energy world, it can't even be physical, and the idea that it is physical and I'm just this body here is a massive part of the illusion. Well, we can all flip the blame for all the pain into the idea of the ego. Now, all you got to do is swap the word Satan or devil into ego, and now every spiritual text will make more sense. All Satan is, there's not little dude with the pitchfork. That's more physical thinking. Okay? We don't need to think of it physically. That's more ego. To think of it spiritually is to realize the ego is a perception of the false self. Let's drive all our blame into that. Now we've got the same common enemy. Right? It's a shared common enemy. You've got it, I've got it, we're all afflicted by it. And the only reason I ever suffer is because I look at the world physically. Same thing. If it's not even a physical world, we might as well blame that perception for the suffering. And that's part of Lojong into Bodhicitta. Drive all blame into one. And there it is. The ego is the cause of all suffering. Train without bias in all areas. It is crucial always to do this pervasively and wholeheartedly. Without bias. Why do we have bias? Why are some people Christian and others Jewish and others Muslim and others Buddhist and others Hindus and others atheists? Why? Well, it's ultimately biased based upon who taught you what when. Why do some people root for the Pittsburgh Steelers, another for the Baltimore Ravens, another for the Cleveland Browns? Why? That's conditioning. Who was your daddy? Who was your mommy? What did your culture teach you? Why do we have culture ideas and fashion? Why do we have music tastes and food tastes? Why do we have interest in these things that vary from culture to culture? Okay? It's conditioning. To train without bias is to say there's some truths, like gravity, that affect everybody no matter what. And it's not about who's right or wrong in the flesh. As Rumi says, beyond the idea of right doing and wrong doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. That's without bias. That's recognizing behind who's right and who's wrong, and I feel this way because you did this to me and all that stuff, which just causes individual pain. There's a truth. There's a field of energy. There's a peaceful field, the field of essence and the beingness of everything. And that's a very peaceful field. That's why we have to do this without bias. As soon as you start saying, my guy's right and your guy's wrong, or I'm bad and you're good, or I should feel shame because of what I did, and all that stuff, that's all labels. It's all physical world conditioning. But if we can get past all that to train without bias and treat everybody as a spiritual equal, because we are, once we do that, we've now trained without bias. It's crucial to do this pervasively and wholeheartedly, which means we can't just put a little bit of effort into it. To do it pervasively all the time and do it with passion is to recognize these truths, which work. Again, practice them, they'll work. Practice division beliefs, see how that works. The United States political establishment's all about this. A whole bunch of people are freaking out because they're so terrified of what's about to happen in an upcoming election. Well, you don't need to worry about it nearly as much if you realize you're a spiritual being. And that sometimes stuff happens. And if you can adjust to that stuff by being spiritual, you know exactly what Jesus did with his crucifixion. If you can do that, you're free. That's what liberation means. Why Buddha says strive for your own liberation is to look at the world correctly as it actually is, as opposed to physically, which is the illusion. Slogan 50, don't be swayed by external circumstances. Alright? This stuff is great when you're thinking about it in an office setting, okay? What happens when you have to go apply it? External circumstances. We lose our mind fast. Krishna says when your senses are controlled and you keep recalling sense objects with your mind, you are a self-deluded hypocrite. That means when you know this stuff is true and you don't do it, you're a self-deluded hypocrite. You know better, and you've deluded yourself into falling back into the dream, and now we're going to argue about right and wrong again. The truth is, on a spiritual level, external circumstances are there as a teacher to show you the path that you're walking and how good you are at being balanced. That's a very, very important belief. Don't let those external circumstances sway you. Carl Jung, when you look outside you dream, when you look inside you awaken. Very Buddhist in this regard. Outside is a dream. What do they say? Way back earlier slogan, regard everything as a dream. But when you go inside, because you're done obsessing over physical world expectations, now you have an awakening quality. And now you feel, oh, there's home, there's spirit, there's the Tao. You bring that, like the Tao says, you bring that back down into earth, now you're going to have some real power, but it's going to be effective spiritual power. It's going to be the idea of what Bodhichitta is, the mind that strives towards awakening and empathy and compassion for everyone. Because once you've tasted it, that's all you want. Everybody else to have it. Not to take it for yourself. It's to try to share it. Love another as oneself. A couple more. Don't wallow in self-pity. Now again, I'm just talking about spiritual teachings. You're not going to read many spiritual teachings about victimization. The freedom from victimization when you've been victimized is through spirituality. Is through forgiving. It's through loving the enemy. In the ego world, we can argue about this. That's totally fine. I'm all for justice in the physical world. Not a problem. But the spiritual world is always justice. Okay? Because we're all going through some sort of process of awakening. And those who go through difficult stuff, as Jesus said, blessed are the persecuted in righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It's totally fair. That's why he went to the cross. That wasn't fair at all physically, but he made it fair. Because spiritually, no matter what you go through, that option's always there for you. Tap into the light. You just took the darkness and you turned it into light. Now you're a single-minded man. And you won't be unstable in all your ways. In fact, you'll be stable in everything. Always seek the light in every experience you've ever had. Don't wallow in self-pity. From the universe's perspective, nothing bad is happening. And the gazelle doesn't complain when the lion comes across it, and he doesn't like it at all. But he doesn't say, this is not fair. The truth of the matter is, again, from a spiritual perspective, it's all fair. And that's what all the prophets teach. We all have to go through misery. In fact, all the prophets did. They all went through misery, and they all came to the same basic conclusion. You're going to go through adversity, like the Buddha said, noble truth number one. Life is suffering, but we cling to the physical world so much that we experience more suffering. When we release it, the suffering goes away. 2 more. Don't be jealous. How simple is that? What a simple belief. Don't be jealous. What are we jealous of? We're jealous of stuff. We're jealous of other people's materials. No one's jealous because somebody else is forgiving and hopeful, right? And filled with love. You actually appreciate that about them. At least if you're spiritual. Spiritual people don't argue about who's more forgiving, right? Or who's more modest. That would be a strange thing to argue about. I'm more humble than you. Okay? Spirituality is recognizing that all of us have the same basic innate ability to be spiritual. And if you are experiencing it, I'm thankful for you. And I'm grateful that you're having that experience, and you do the same. We're only jealous of other people's physical circumstances. Well, what if there are no physical circumstances? Hence, Lojong, right? To have the clear mind is to realize the only circumstances we want to pay attention to is how woke are you, okay? And the last one, perfect one, is actually slogan 59. Don't expect applause. Buddha has a teaching that we should all be like trees. A tree is strongly rooted, at least big strong trees are strongly rooted, and as such wind can come. And he says praise and blame are like the wind. The tree just might sway a little bit, but it's going to not get knocked over by too much praise or too much blame. Okay? Don't expect applause. If what we're doing is for applause, that's ego. Jesus says at least 3 or 4 times in the New Testament, he says some version of, if what you're doing is for human applause, for a human award, I say to get your Christian of the Year plaque, if that's why you're doing what you're doing, he says you have your reward. If you're just doing things to get other people's attention, ego. The true believer, he says, prays in the privacy of their own bedroom. He's ultimately referring to this, of the mind and the interior, but it's the same thing, is that what you're doing is to try to get attention from other people, he says you have your reward. Applause is not exactly what we're looking for spiritually, okay? Truth by itself is its own reward. You don't need anyone to pat you on the back and say, good job, you're spiritual now. Your tasting of the divinity for yourself is sufficient. Your knowing that the Tao is a thing, or that the Holy Spirit is a thing, that everybody has access to this, that's sufficient. Ram Dass says, for one who has had the experience, no explanation is necessary. And for one who has not had the experience, no explanation is possible. What it means is that I have the ability to do it, you have the ability to do it. All of us have the ability to do it. Don't expect applause. When you have the experience of it, that is sufficient unto itself.